Thank you to everyone joining us today from across the country and around the world. I'm Michael Higgs, Program Specialist here at Conscious Capitalism, Inc. On behalf of the entire CCI team, we appreciate you taking time to learn and grow in community with us. Today, we're joined by Andrew Connor, the Director of the Center for Community Ownership, to discuss how community ownership has emerged as a model for economic development and business retention, shared wealth creation, access, and opportunity. As many of you know, conscious capitalism is a philosophy that emphasizes the human nature of business, as well as a movement of business leaders from around the world working to change the practice and perception of capitalism as a means to elevate humanity. Conscious Capitalism, Inc. is a nonprofit organization dedicated to catalyzing that movement by creating learning opportunities like today's session and building systems of support for practicing conscious capitalists through our Senior Leader Network membership. Several times a month, we're offering these virtual gatherings as a way for the community to see how this philosophy takes shape in the leadership journeys and business practices of those in our network. Today's gathering will run for about 45 minutes. Andrew and I will be in conversation for about 30 minutes, and then we'll transition to audience questions for the last 10 to 15 minutes of our time together. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of the questions as we can during our time together. If you have any technical questions or issues, please email us at info@consciouscapitalism.org. And it is now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Today, we're excited to be joined by Andrew Connor, who has spent the last decade working on new economic issues and innovative forms of community development. He's the founder and director of the Center for Community Ownership, CCO, which is based in Missoula, Montana. The CCO supports urban and rural communities around the country in using community-owned business models to drive positive change and build wealth. Andrew, thanks for being here. I just recently learned about your organization, and I'm excited to dive into some questions and learn a little bit more about the work you're doing in the world. So to kick things off, tell us a little bit more about the Center for Community Ownership. What does the organization do? And personally, how did you get involved? Maybe a little personal history on how you found yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for everyone for being here. The journey really started a little over 10 years ago. I used to work at an organization called the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, or BALI. It's now Common Future, and a great organization that did a ton of work in the kind of new economy space, just highlighting and supporting really creative, innovative, socially and environmentally responsible business, economic justice type projects all over the US and Canada. So I was exposed to all this like great work that was happening in all these different communities, all these really creative, innovative people who are just doing super impactful stuff. And I was one of the many things that we featured were different sort of varieties of community-owned enterprise models. And I was always just like really kind of taken by some of the ways that these communities had rallied in the face of adversity or particular challenges to do something that was really transformative, something that they needed, something that really, improved their local economies, their local communities, and so forth. So it just sort of stuck with me as this really like powerful, like kind of potent thing. And so when I moved on from Bali, I was really interested in seeing if I could kind of cultivate more of this. There's kind of both tremendous need and tremendous opportunity out there for this kind of work, because the community ownership approach, like, it's a real remedy for market failures that can occur in some communities, right? Like you might have situations where there's plenty of customers, there's a market, but for whatever reason the community doesn't have the local entrepreneurs or the local investors or a chain store serving that need, for whatever reason. Even though it's a viable market, there are all kinds of reasons why a business might not just sort of emerge through the traditional channels kind of organically. And so this is a real strategy where communities can take matters into their own hand. They don't have to wait around for a chain store to decide to relocate there. They don't need to ask for a handout. They can pool their capital and their resources to create community-owned enterprises to serve their needs, to improve their communities and so forth. So, so I looked at sort of the landscape and I was just like constantly reading all these stories about places losing, rural downtowns, losing or rural communities losing their grocery stores, downtown businesses shuttering, urban communities that are food deserts, and that, just kind of there's this real mismatch between like need and the provision of businesses. And so that was like the need. And then the opportunity was really, when you look at it, like even communities that are considered low income or low worth, or low wealth, excuse me, not low worth, low wealth, have more resources than people think they do. If you can look at the bank deposits, the FDIC has this lookup tool, and you can look up by zip code and see how much money is just sitting in checking and savings accounts and CDs and money market accounts in banks in certain zip codes. And some small population zip codes that are considered low wealth have tens of millions of dollars, sitting collectively in bank accounts, and it's just distributed. And so people sort of identify the community as a low wealth community, but coming together and pooling those resources together really can provide the capital. And there's always personal resources and experience in those communities to make this kind of thing happen. So I felt like there was just all this need and all this opportunity, and I'd seen these great examples of things that had worked in different communities. So I started the Center for Community Ownership to try to bridge that gap between the need and the opportunity, to both spread the word, because a lot of places get stuck in these situations. They have no idea that this is an option, and if they do decide they are interested in this, they have to reinvent the wheel and start from scratch and try to sort of piece it together. So I wanted to both do the education to let communities know that this is an option, and then also bring the sort of technical assistance to the table, the legal and the financial and the other technical resources needed to make it happen, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel. And so this really is just a dual strategy that we are kind of like trying to put more out into the world to help, do positive community economic development, and also serve as sort of a wealth building opportunity for community investors that are providing the capital for this to happen.
Fascinating. You made a point there, Andrew, that I don't think a lot of people consider, which is this sort of locked up capital in checking and savings accounts in communities. I wasn't aware of the FDIC tool that you're referring to, but that's fascinating to consider that there are these sort of trapped resources of capital that could serve the community and benefit.
Yeah, well, and that's like there's sort of two places where our capital is going. It's either sitting in bank accounts, or it's going to Wall Street. And we don't have like sort of a well-developed infrastructure for like many other forms of investment. And that is a field that is maturing, but it is still very new. And so we're starting to try to cultivate a little bit of broadening of the options for people to invest, to actually be able to directly invest back in their communities.
Fascinating. Well, the work sounds incredible and amazing, and very service oriented for the communities that you're building these businesses out in. Can you share a couple examples of success or projects that you're working on currently?
Yeah, sure. And let me say a couple things. So one is that, well, one example I'll tell you about, which is not a project that we worked on, but it was one that was a real inspiration, and one of the ones that we highlighted when I was back at Bali. And that's a store called the Quimper Mercantile, which is out in Port Townsend, Washington. And back in 2012, it was sort of the classic case that a lot of these communities find themselves in. They had like their last sort of general retail store that I forget what it was, but I think it was some chain that was closing down. And it was going to be like an hour drive to like the closest place where they could buy socks. It was really going to sort of create this real pinch point, for them. And so they came together and created this, solicited community investment, sold shares, created this business, and they launched in 2012, and they're still going strong now. And they have, I think it's every year, but the first two, maybe, they've been profitable since then. They've expanded, they brought on more, community investors. Their payroll is like $500,000. They have, many employees. It's just been this real, tremendous success story for how this kind of thing could work out. So again, we didn't have anything to do with that, but that was a real sort of shining example of how a community can really mobilize in that way. we do sort of two main forms of work. We work with both communities that want to fill holes in their local economies by starting something new. And then we also work with business owners that are looking to transition out, and either out of necessity, because maybe they don't, where they are, they don't have a good succession plan option. There isn't somebody there who alone has the capital to sort of purchase or take over their business and continue it, or just because they're sort of community oriented and they think that the community is the right steward for the business long term. It's actually a way to sell an existing business to the community to preserve the jobs and the tax revenues and the services and so forth. So we have kind of a mix of projects. So some that we're working on right now, we're working in a neighborhood in North St. Louis that is a food desert, and we're working with them to create a community-owned store, a community-owned grocery store. So that's a really exciting project that we're working on with some great partners there. Up in my neck of the woods in Montana, further north here, up outside of Glacier National Park, there's a restaurant that is owned by some entrepreneurs who are, they're in that category where they're selling it to the community. They're actually on reservation land outside of the park, and they're just really interested in sort of selling this into community hands to have it preserved in that way. And then, yeah, just a different kind of project, also working in Baltimore with a community that is creating a vehicle for community-owned commercial real estate to serve as a community economic development driver, an opportunity for lower wealth residents to build wealth, having access to commercial real estate investment, and provide space for local entrepreneurs and local businesses as well. So that's just sort of a little bit of a flavor of some of the kind of projects that we're working on.
Fascinating. I know that we're in the midst of one of the greatest wealth transfers in a very long time in the United States with the aging demographic. So for business owners, yet another opportunity for them to look at a model upon which to sort of pass the business on. This is a bit different. And it leads me into my next question, which is I think a lot of people in our community may, very familiar with the traditional business structures, the C Corps, the S Corps, the LLCs, et cetera, familiar with EO, employee ownership, and maybe cooperatives. Can you talk a little bit about how your work might relate to those existing structures or highlight some of the differences?
Yeah, sure. So I would say that we have a pretty expansive, we have a very expansive notion of community ownership. We aren't so attached to one specific model. Our interest is in evaluating the needs of the community and determining what the right business structure, what the right organizational structure, what the right governance, what the right model is, all those kind of things we think really need to be customized based on the situation. So to your point, a lot of people, when they hear community ownership, the first thing they think of is cooperatives, which is understandable because that has been, historically the most well-developed sector. It's the one that sort of has been tried the most and has the most sort of resources and infrastructure around it and so forth. But these kind of things can take so many different forms, from nonprofit social enterprises to traditional business formats, like you mentioned, like we use C Corps a lot. That's like sort of our default, to cooperatives of different flavors, to trusts, and there's kind of all these different hybrids and versions that can be used. Our kind of default is that what we often say to communities or businesses or clients that we're working with is, we start on the simple end of things. We really are sort of an advocate for using those traditional business structures unless you have a really compelling reason to do something else. Sometimes it is really valuable to have a nonprofit in the mix and have some sort of hybrid structure. Maybe people are really committed to a cooperative, so we're going to go that route. But sometimes that stuff, it's a whole layer of administrative cost and burden to do a cooperative. There's additional levels of compliance. You need professional service providers who know how to work with co-ops, and sometimes there's a rigidity to them that can be a real plus in terms of putting guardrails and so forth, but that can also limit your options in terms of capital raising and how you design governance and so forth. So so we are open to working with a wide range of models, but our kind of ethos is to keep it as simple as possible, as familiar as possible, to keep, again, that administrative and cost burden down, to make it easier to communicate with people, to say kind of like, hey, this is just like a traditional business. The only difference is we've got a distributed ownership that's made up of a lot of community investors rather than a small concentrated group or a single owner entrepreneur. But everything else lives and breathes just like a regular business would, it's just like any other C Corp kind of thing. And another subset of that, is worker cooperatives, which you mentioned, employee ownership. And that's another cool thing about sort of approaching it with a little bit more of this expansive mindset, is that we can look at sort of hybrid combinations as well. We can sort of we can design, if employee ownership is a really important part of one of these projects, we can design it in such a fashion where we look at balancing the power between the employees and the rest of the community investors, or the decision-making control resides with the employees, but the financial ownership and the capital raise is distributed broadly among the community. So, there's all sorts of creative and innovative ways that we can put these kind of models into practice.
Got it. So if I'm hearing you, what the opportunity that you're providing is, whatever your said business structure is, there's an opportunity. You're using familiar terms, the governance, the investors, rather than maybe a small cohort of private equity investors. You're sort of opening the doors up to the communities that your businesses are operating in.
Exactly. We're saying, like, sure, one option is to make this business or sell this business to one person or a group of 5 people, who can bring all that capital and expertise to the table. Alternately, sell it to 100 people in your community, or 500 people, or 500 of you come together, and we'll help organize the process for making this sort of happen, and bringing it all together. Because people's immediate reaction, understandably, is like, it's a lot easier to talk to 3 people than to 300 people, or to wrangle 3 people rather than 300 people. And sure, there's some truth to that, but it's a trade-off, right? The flip side is, a business that has 300 community owners, I mean, you'd better believe that the breadth of support and the community's literal and figurative investment in the success of that thing, and all the things you can draw on in terms of people's experience and their personal networks and their professional expertise, really, it is a lot of work. But what it creates is a business that is going to be locally owned forever and is incredibly solid and has this really broad foundation in all these other ways.
Yeah. So as you're suggesting, you're able to sort of leverage the expertise, the skills, the curiosity, the interest, the pride,
energy, the enthusiasm.
Exactly. All of those things that a community may express to say, hey, this is a business that is community owned in the place that I live.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. So just in the spirit of again, thinking about the communities, are there certain kinds of communities or maybe situations that this model is best suited for? Or could this work anywhere? New York City, Missoula, Montana, Cody, Wyoming.
I'll caveat this in like two directions, I think. One is we have limited data. It is sort of, like I said, it's kind of emerged organically. I mean, you could go back historically. I don't, I'm sort of interested to dig into this in a deeper way. My suspicion is if you go back far enough, every business was probably like a community-owned business. Like in a sense, we probably get back to a point where like whenever something of any kind of scale was happening, it was pretty like the whole village was chipping in a way.
Well, we were geographically constrained, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you couldn't go over that mountain range to necessarily buy a bag of rice or a bag of flour.
Totally. And if you wanted to expand your flour mill, for most of human history, there was no bank, or there was no like whatever. It was like you needed the people around you. So I don't, this is some armchair economic history here, but my suspicion is that there are probably countless examples over the course of human history. But at the very least, we can say you know, over recent decades, it's kind of cropped up organically, again, out of need, you know, especially in the like plains states that are, you know, low population and far apart, where it's like the retail store closes and all of a sudden you're looking at a 2-hour round trip to Walmart, you know, or whatever to buy anything, you know, or many of your needs. And, you know, I think even if you go a little earlier in American history, you know, we have a long history of sort of like cooperative associations or community, you know, there is a less formal, you know, sort of community investment, community ownership type stuff. So, you know, so that's my one caveat is it's in this sort of way that we are formalizing and talking about now, it's pretty new field, community investment, you know, the laws allowing for unaccredited investors to participate in things like investment crowdfunding are only, you know, 6 years old, you know, or have only been, you know, implemented, you know, in the last 5 or 6 years. So it's new, really new. And so we're still figuring out. So limited data points, and we're not totally sure. It is definitely true that this comes up a lot. There are some specific places where this comes up, right? Like the grocery industry, the retail industry. There are specific sectors where there's sort of these emergency situations where stores are closing, businesses are closing. To your point, you know, business owners are aging out and there's people aren't to replace them in some of these, especially like small rural communities and whatnot. So there are definitely places where this kind of acute market emergency provides a real boost for like, uh-oh, we better do something. So like there's a lot of energy that people are really invested in making it happen. And that seems to be a pretty significant catalyst. My contention though, is that there is really no reason why this couldn't be applied in any context. You know, you could be an economically healthy, mid-sized city that is in a state like Montana that's saying, hey, things are going pretty well, but we still like, we're losing a lot of college graduates to Seattle because they want to go get a certain kind of job. We don't want to lose those young people, and getting good paying jobs where they can afford to stay here and live here and have a satisfying career. Like, let's do something like come together as a community and create like an IT firm, you know, and provide the capital and organize it and provide jobs for a dozen, you know, recent college grads with some sort of expertise that they can hone their craft here rather than going away. So it's like, that's not a brick and mortar store necessarily. That's not responding to an emergency, but man, how incredibly valuable would that be for community development? And there's no reason it couldn't work, right? If the market is there, if there's a solid business plan, you know, something I always say, if it can survive as a business or thrive as a business, it can thrive as a community-owned business. You know, the only difference is that we're talking about, instead of 10 people on the board of directors that are sort of overseeing it, there are 500 people in the community, and they are electing 10 of themselves to be on the board of directors to then hire the manager. You know, it's like there shouldn't theoretically be any tangible obstacles to making that kind of thing happen. It's the imagination, it's the care, it's the sort of willingness of the community to come together to take on a project like this that probably should determine it, rather than some industry or specific sector.
Gotcha. Awesome. And then one question I had was, you know, for businesses, certainly we have some business owners joining us on the call today virtually. Can you explain a little bit more about the process, what it might take for either business owners or the communities that they opt for? Anyone who's, we're all members of the community right on this call, but for community members that might be pushing this initiative or this structure forward in the communities that they either operate their businesses in or live in, what can they do to what's the next step? Like,
yeah. Well, I'll say a couple things. So first of all, ways that sort of, okay, so the question of like business communities that are interested in this potentially, or businesses that are interested, you know, the first step is to have, you know, to have 5 phone calls with me, you know, like, and, which means, you know, conveying all the, you know, the sense of sort of like, this is what's involved, you know, it's a process of figuring out legal entity structure stuff, and what is the new entity, and how is it going to be governed, and what are the values that are important about as we're designing the kind of governance and the foundational documents for this new entity. And do we care about control being rooted in a certain geography? Do we care? Are there other sort of dynamics we need to account for as we're designing this stuff? So it's like entity and structure and legal stuff. There is all of the sort of financial work associated with creating the investment securities. So, the SEC, you have to register with the SEC. So there's all this paperwork and disclosure and production of documents that has to happen. So, it's all this sort of like nuts and bolts stuff. That stuff is annoying and it's time consuming, but that's in a sense the easier part. The bigger, more substantial part is the social part. Like, who are the networks of people who are involved in this? Who's going to drive the ship? Who's going to work on the strategy for the campaign? Who are the hundreds of people we're going to have one-on-one conversations with to ask them if they want to be community investors, community owners? What's the campaign for getting the word out? Having, media, just the whole creation of the story and the campaign and all of that. So that is, there's more to say about that, but those are basically the main sort of elements that need to be attended to, that kind of legal part, the financial part, and then all those sort of social dynamics of kind of moving that forward. So that's if a community is directly interested in doing that, or a business is directly interested in doing that. There are some other ways that businesses could sort of take action to, kind of like support or make this kind of work happen, even if they are not directly, even if a business is not selling itself to the community or whatnot. There are ways that they could support this work. Like if they identify that their local economy has a hole in it, they could play a really good role motivating the community, catalyzing, supporting. This takes work and administrative infrastructure. So if they can provide some of that kind of, like, they already have people on staff who can help with some of those things to help organize and mobilize the community. So whether that's starting something new and filling a hole, or if they see one of their fellow businesses in the community that maybe is looking to transition and doesn't have a good owner, like that, sort of helping nurture that process. And businesses can invest. They can invest as community owners themselves. There's a lot of different ways, and I'll actually mention one. I spoke to someone who might actually be on this call, so I will anonymize this conversation because I don't want to out them, because I don't know if they're going to end up wanting to sort of work on this or not. But I thought they had a brilliant idea for the implementation of this, which is that they are they're a business that has a really strong conservation aspect, the real strong environmental conservation aspect to the work that they do. It's a part of their business. And they're also really invested in rural economic development. And so as a part of their business expansion, which is also in support of their values and their alignment, they want to support the creation of a bunch of local businesses in rural communities around the US. That's sort of a part of their vision. Which will sort of feed their supply chain. It'll be a part of their kind of business network, but they don't want to start all those businesses and own them on their own. They actually want to cultivate the creation of local businesses. And so they're really interested in this idea of them playing a role to catalyze locally owned businesses, community owned businesses in all of these different places, which they would be sort of partners with. So they're going to potentially provide the kind of impetus and the support to help make that happen. And then they'll create all these little community-owned partner businesses that will be a part of their kind of greater business network. So, there's just all kinds of creative solutions and ideas like that that I think could be really powerful.
Awesome. I do want to ask one final question before we move to Q&A, and this is just a quick announcement for anyone joining us. If you do have any questions for Andrew, I see we've got a number of questions in the Q&A box, but don't hesitate to put one in there, and time provided, we'll be sure to get to it. So, Andrew, for my final question, when we start talking about shared wealth or community-owned, some people may get this idea that, well, this isn't capitalism. Can you speak a little bit to, how you feel that this actually is a model that is representative of capitalism?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one that I think is actually, it gets to the core of something that I really love about this work, and which really drew me to this work, is that, you're never gonna, you're never gonna silence all the critics. But something that I think is super cool about this approach is that it really, it really does transcend a lot of our kind of traditional notions. You know, we have such a habit of reducing everything to these sort of polarized dualities, right? Of like capitalism and anti-capitalism, or capitalism, socialism, or capitalism, not, you know, like, but this is, in my mind, it is a very like sort of, it is a high level capitalism that integrates a lot of the things that people who might be capitalism skeptic, you know, disregard for community well-being, or, you know, disconnection or alienation, like things that often, you know, capitalism is sort of accused of fostering or cultivating. You know, this is something that in my mind, you know, takes all the familiar tools of capitalism and business structures. Like I said, you know, my preferred approach is to stay kind of like as status quo as possible, in sense of like, it is in a sense using a very non-radical approach to achieve things that are pretty radical and transformative. You know, it is using these tools that already exist in a way that is really powerful and really like valuable. So yeah, it is, in my mind, you know, at least it is capitalism that should be about as easy to become literally and figuratively invested in and supportive of as anything. You know what I mean? It is fully accountable. So it's like what the community cares about, this business can care about. What the community wants to do, they have control over this business. So it's like, if you don't like it, change it. You know what I mean? It is using the sort of the power and the freedom and the openness of capitalism to be in direct service of what the community wants, needs, and desires.
Fantastic. Thank you. So we'll go ahead and jump to some of the questions that are coming in the Q&A box. And I'm going to take the first question I'm going to take and offer to you, Andrew, is from Kevin. And I imagine this may be a question that you get when you're doing some advising for potential clients or people that are interested in your work. Kevin asked, with this type of community ownership, do you have ideas about how to structure a way out for investors? So the exit for investors. Mm-hmm. You know, as an example, how can someone sell shares? How do you stop someone from buying up these shares and ending up with all the control?
Yeah. So I'll work my way back, and maybe you can keep track of those sub questions and let me know
sure.
if I hit everything.
Yeah.
So on the control front, that's another one of those things that you can really design in. So for example, so some projects we work on, they don't really care. They're not worried about control. They're just like, we just need a grocery store. Like some of the bigger picture questions of like power and control, like not really relevant. We're really about like on the ground results or whatnot. Many of the other projects I work on, they do really care about that. They really don't want to reproduce power dynamics associated with the wealth gap, or you know, issues that might come from that sort of scenario, exactly what they're describing. What happens if there's a real imbalance where you have somebody that owns a controlling share or whatnot. So we often are putting into practice things like a one investor, one vote model. So basically your eligibility is not, you do not have power proportional to the amount of shares, just simply all investors have equal power. Or even going further, we have set up some situations, or we're working on some situations where the investors can be, for example, like anywhere in the country. But in order to serve on the board or vote for the board, you have to both be an investor and live in a certain geography. So the returns on the capital will flow to all the investors proportional to their investment, but the power is localized, again, like maybe on a one investor, one vote basis, to people who are only in a specific place, or who only meet a specific criteria, or who are only engaged in a certain way. So you can kind of design a lot of that control to sort of, if mitigating something like that scenario that they described is important, then that can be done. Did you want to say something before I moved on?
No, I was going to say, well, I'm hearing you say that many of the solutions sort of lie in either structure or governance. You're able to sort of solve for these unique scenarios.
And that's one of the things that's good about using those traditional business structures, is that they are at root sort of designed for flexibility and customization, and they don't have a lot of constraints on them. So you really can, kind of decide what's important and make it happen. On the first part of that question, which was sound like it was about the exit for the investors.
Yeah, exit
So
strategy.
yeah, so there's a couple things about that. I mean, one, again, there are some circumstances where it's pretty apparent that, you know, it's a small scale thing in a community where they are not, you know, the difference between this as an investment and a donation is pretty slim. So it's extremely patient capital and they're not looking for much of a return. And their thing is like, as long as we have the grocery store, that is enough of a return for me, you know, but those situations are not always the case. And so in place, we do generally want these businesses to, again, be viable, profitable. Like that's what we're looking to create, is things that can succeed in the market. And often we do something where we will build into the plan and the offering documents and so forth. We'll say something like, every year, depending on, you know, net revenue for the business and authorization of the board, that we will like buy back up to 5% of, you know, outstanding shares. So the company itself will provide an option to sort of buy out investors and set the terms for that, or, you know, how those shares are priced or evaluated or things like that. And alternately, there's ways where we can sort of match make. If community investors want to sell and others want to buy in, you know, that's an option. There are some legal, you know, with investment crowdfunding, at least, there are some legal rights that people have to, after I think 6 months or a year, to sell their shares to whoever they want. You know, they actually can just sort of sell them directly. That is less likely to happen because we don't have sort of a liquid market for a secondary market, you know, for those kind of shares. But we encourage the businesses to set up at least some sort of arena, you know, a place where investors, pathway for investors to get cashed out by the business itself, and then also maybe some sort of arena through which shares can be exchanged among members of the community as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm going to jump to a question from William. And I think this question is a little bit more, do you have a point of view on this? But William asks, what are you thinking about the loss of retail-related businesses to some of the e-commerce giants? Names unsaid, but
I can't imagine who they would be referring to. Just real quick, I saw in the Q&A somebody asked about contact information, so I'm just putting my website in the chat real quick for everybody. There's a contact form there, so somebody asked what the best way to reach me was, so that's a good spot there. Yeah, so I mean, I will never pretend that this is some sort of silver bullet solution to the, you know, transformation of the retail economy and the online, you know, behemoths that have been mentioned. But I think everything that we can do to, I mean, again, it's a question of if the community cares. If the community doesn't care and they want to shop online and they don't care if there's retail stores downtown and they don't see the value in that, both of the economic value, well, that's their choice. You know, it's, and I mean, maybe we have a lot of education to do to really convey the scale of that economic impact and the social and cultural impact that comes from the loss of those community businesses, community retail businesses, and brick and mortar downtown type businesses. So yeah, I guess I can, that's maybe the most salient thing I can say is, it's not like it's going to solve that problem, but again, it's a pathway where a community can say, like, you know what, we care about having a shoe store downtown. That actually matters to us, and nobody's starting that, and we're going to, you know, because we're fine buying all this other stuff online, but we want to be able to try shoes on before we buy them. You know what I mean? So like, it is sort of putting the tool in the community's hand and saying, like, if this is something you're complaining about and something that you care about, here's a way out. Here's a solution. Wonderful.
I know we only have about 3 minutes remaining, and I want to jump to one of the questions that Eric Moss had. He's just asking about, do you have any connections in academia, for example, community colleges? Are you sort of looking to either lean into the expertise of that generation that's coming up and maybe seeped in business practices and new business models or new ways of thinking about social enterprise?
So yeah, in a sense, like we've had some interns who are particularly interested in kind of like local investing and community investing, excuse me, and this kind of economic work. I don't know if this is a part of Eric's question, but we definitely, we probably haven't done this to the degree that would be worth it, but community colleges, again, as sort of as anchor institutions, as institutions that can provide some of the support needed to mobilize a community and manage a project like this. That's actually a really interesting. Most of the entities we've connected with have been sort of like at the more like the 4-year university type level.
Sure.
But and maybe this is what Eric is getting at. Community colleges are more distributed and they are often in smaller communities, and there could be some really powerful opportunity there. So I don't have too much of an answer to that, but I will say thank you, Eric, for that suggestion, because I'm actually going to put it on my list of things to think about. So
fascinating. Well, Andrew, in our final minute, I want to thank you for sharing your experience and educating our community about the Center for Community Ownership and taking all of the questions that have come forth, and truly a spirited conversation.
And I'll just say real quick, Michael, before you wrap up, I know there were some unanswered questions there. I am available. If people have more questions or want to reach out over email or want to set up a call or anything, go to that contact form at the website, centerforcommunityownership.org, and I'd be happy to make time for anybody who wants to talk.
Well, you are gracious and kind. Thank you, Andrew. And for our participants, I just want to remind you that we have a survey that Kim has put in the chat. Please take a moment. I think it's one question to let us know how we might improve our future programming. If you're new to Conscious Capitalism and it's the first time joining us, welcome. You can find more information about our movement and organization at consciouscapitalism.org. And if you're an executive currently implementing conscious practices in your business, we invite you to explore our growing network of like-minded leaders with our Conscious Capitalism Senior Leader Network. You can find more information on our website there. Kim has also graciously put a link in the chat. And final announcement, just want to give a quick plug for next week's virtual gathering. Next week, we will have CCI, Conscious Capitalism Inc.'s board member, and Scribe Media CEO Javon McCormick. He's going to share his insights in what it takes to be a modern leader, giving his perspective on how to embrace responsibility and take action as a leader and what it means to prioritize people as a conscious capitalist. And Kim has dropped that into the chat as well. Andrew, we are officially 1 minute over. Thank you so much for your time today. And again, thank you for the work you're doing in the world and for the communities across this country.
Well, thanks again. Thanks for having me. And thanks to everyone for attending. Really appreciate everybody's time.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.